future of not only the future of the Jewish people, but the future of humankind in general. And I am just going to give one example to offer this broader view of what that future and Yiddish was all about. On the one hand, we have the proponents of the Yiddish novels and Yiddish short stories and Yiddish essays, Mendele Forum and Sholem Aleichem, and the great intellectual parrots who bring forth a vision through literature of what is and should be to be an Ashkenazi Jew, and to have this language that is like German, like French, like English, like Italian, a national language, and even in some cases, depending on the author, a nationalist language that should lead us to the creation of a state, and I'm talking about a particular trend of Yiddishists, a state where Yiddish should become the national language. It results in all kinds of zigzagging. On the one hand, you have what Stalin would end up doing in Birobidzhan, creating a special place where the Yiddish language will be part of the Soviet landscape, but rather than it being a form of pride, it's a form of ghettoization and isolation and punishment that comes from the higher levels of power in the Soviet regime throughout the minority Jewish population. There is also the one Eliezer ben Yehuda, who, having been a Yiddish speaker, switches to Hebrew and decides that Hebrew should be the language of the new Jewish state, travels with his family to Palestine and envisions an intrinsic Zionist view that will have the Hebrew language as a vital point of renewal that will connect back to the past, the biblical time, talk about the future looking forward as it looks back, and that without this essential component, Hebrew, there would not be the possibility of really creating a Jewish, authentically Jewish homeland. It is symptomatic that as some Jews are thinking that there should be a Jewish state with Yiddish as its main language, there are also some Yiddish speakers, again, the case of Ben Yehuda, that decide that Yiddish is too vulnerable, is too packed with the prototypes, stereotypes, archetypes of the diaspora, in that in order to truly be new, we have to go back to the language of the Davidic Empire, not Yiddish, but Hebrew, to create a new Jewish self, a new Jewish model of being. On the other side, there's another Eliezer, and that is the creator of Esperanto, also a Yiddish speaker, also from the Pale of Settlement, who visualizes a moment in the future where the peace of all nations will come if everybody finds a common second language, which is in many ways what Yiddish was to many members of the Pale of Settlement. A second language that would be an invented, artificial, lab-created tongue, Esperanto, that would borrow from a variety of different sources to allow an absence of national mythology, an absence of guilt, an absence of a specific historical background, and where people will find themselves fully comfortable in the middle. As you also know, friends, Esperanto remains a global force, but it never achieved the status or the promise that it had in the inception of Eliezer Zamenhof. And though on occasion the Esperantistas meet in congresses in different places, and there have been many translations into Esperanto of major works from Alice in Wonderland to The Little Prince, this second language, like Yiddish, that Zamenhof invented because of what Yiddish was to many of them, could not quite help us become more humane, more peaceful, more of a community, in a global community of people. What is the other two terms, science and fiction, are essential and essential to the Ashkenazi group that I'm trying to explore here. But again, they need to be qualified. Whereas because of the conditions of many of the Jews in the Pale of Settlement, education of higher learning in particular was rather limited in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, we don't find among that population what we find today that is so common. Jewish scientists. We have people that dream with becoming in the future physicians or chemists, but the dream is too remote. They are mainly there to survive, and that survival has much to do with the immediate needs, daily needs. There is also the fact that science within the Jewish community had been no-no for the rabbinical establishment, for the Talmudic establishment, and the path to a better future, particularly for men, was seen through religion, through the yeshivas, through the Talmudic academies, and and because Jews were not invited to be fully part of the university system at that time, it was the prestige came not by going into those particular fields, but by going into the fields that had been ours from ancestral times, particularly in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the rabbinical universe. It is also important to keep in mind, and here I come to another aspect that is crucial to me, that the Yiddish that the secular Jews were expounding in that period, I'm locating myself in the second half of the 19th century again, was the one that the one that connected with literature was mainly experienced by secular Jews, Jews that wanted to be normal, that wanted to be like everybody else. In many of the novels that we have, say Tevye der Milchiker, Tevye the Dairyman by Sholem Aleichem, is really the story of that poor, wonderfully sharp, but educationally limited father of many daughters, depending on the chapter of Tevye the Milchiker. He might have 5 daughters, might have 7 daughters, might have more 8 daughters. There were no editors at that time that were the way there are today. And so that and other aspects of the novel kept on changing. It's the story of a desire for upward mobility, not by him individually, but through the marriage of his many daughters. And the many daughters are pushing in different directions. One marries a poor tailor, and one marries a socialist who ends up in Siberia, and the third one marries a non-Jew. And that is where the upward mobility, if there is going to be any kind, is going. But the other side is the Hasidic Yiddish, the Yiddish of the Hasidim, particularly from the Baal Shem Tov onward, that is really very much alive at the time. It is not the secular Yiddish. It's the Yiddish of not of Talmudic discussion, but of storytelling. And it passes on from one particular sect to another. It remains very much alive today. And in fact, if we can say that Yiddish as a futuristic language has any claim in the future for us, though as much as we would like, it is part of certain courses in schools and certain klezmer festivals and film festivals and so on. It is in the mouths, in the communities of the Hasidim, of the Orthodox community, where it mostly lives, though that community doesn't necessarily have much of an interest or high respect for the secular literature that was produced by Yiddish writers from the 19th century to the present. But it is in that world that there is speculative fiction and a fiction about jene Welt, the other world, and about what could happen in alternative universes that is so exquisite and that maybe replaces the absence of science and scientists and futurists that connect science and technology among the Jewish people to the literature that was produced at that time. I'm thinking of images like literally what will happen in the world to come, but also books and golems and goblins and all kinds of other ghosts and uh, creations that might go back to the Bible, Leviathan being one of them, that travel through Jewish history and offer us the opportunity to think of fantasy as very much an aspect of Yiddish life, of Jewish life. Certainly, when Ansky, for instance, this extraordinary playwright of the Dybbuk, travels in between the wars, after the First War, through the Pale of Settlement, to record in Hormon Galicia, in his 4 volumes of what is happening in the territory of Galicia, he comes across a vast array of folkloric stories that deal with the afterlife, that deal with alternative realities, as we would describe them today, that I think are in many ways an aspect of the future or of the other world that are crucial for us as Jews. There's a wonderful story by Sholem Aleichem called Haman and Mordechai. It's a story, I would say it's one of the best 5 short stories by Sholem Aleichem. And the premise of it is rather simple. These 2 characters, Haman and Mordechai, come back and visit Eastern Europe, and no Jew at that time recognizes them. And the author is intent on making the connection that if indeed we wanted to relieve the biblical past at that time in the 19th century, the ignorance that deeply connected with the poverty that the Jews are experiencing would result in the fact that the 2 main characters of that past will be gone without anybody really knowing what to make of them. I can't but, whenever I read that story or whenever I think of that story, think of another story that was written also in the 19th century, not among Jews, by Dostoevsky. It's part of the brothers Karamazov, and it's the story. It's a little kind of novella within the brothers Karamazov that is known as the Grand Inquisitor. It's the story of Jesus that comes back to inquisitorial times in Spain, and Torquemada knows very well who this prophet Messiah is, and because he and his predecessors, Torquemada's predecessors, have built the church not on what Jesus was, but on what the church decided that Jesus was and his messages throughout the future, he is imprisoned and ridiculed and ostracized. It is a very similar example to the one that Sholem Aleichem is bringing, using 2 characters of the past to push them into the present, and seeing what happens with that present time, how the present would react. But from the perspective of Dostoevsky, the critique here is to how institutional Christianity has stolen the message of Jesus' mission, whereas in Sholem Aleichem, the view is that Jews are so poor and so disenfranchised with their own tradition that they no longer can recognize in real, in blood, fresh in blood, the Mordechai and the other characters from the Bible that will visit them at one point. It is not absolutely true to say that there is no Jewish science fiction, Yiddish science fiction in the 19th century or in the 20th century. Jeffrey was mentioning not long ago, just before we started, an anthology really about Jewish, not Yiddish, Jewish science fiction that was called Wandering Stars, that was published 40 years ago or 50 years ago, that includes one or two stories that came from the Yiddish, but the majority of the other ones are from American Jewish writers of Ashkenazi descent, many of them who ended up working in Hollywood or becoming big successes in New York. And that is one. Jeffrey made a quick comment. He said he wasn't impressed with that anthology. I remember as a young Yiddish-speaking, Spanish-speaking Mexican immigrant arriving to New York, eager to find some connection with my own Jewishness, stumbling upon a copy of Wandering Stars and avidly wanting to find something that would allow me to see of the futures imagined by the Yiddish speakers, like my grandmother, like my grandfather, in the form of literature, and being myself quite disappointed. But being struck by the fact that the infrastructure for much of American Jewish science fiction and American science fiction is really the children and the grandchildren of those Yiddish speaking immigrants that came to this country. Just one example is Isaac Asimov, who on occasion would talk in his memoirs and other books of the importance of Yiddish in his background and how the storytelling that came through his parents eventually led him to become a writer, and then he himself had a son who was a writer, and the connection that he saw of the immigration on the one hand, and then the education of science and technology that would come from his own schooling in the United States. I want thus to make an emphasis here of the difference between having not had the opportunity to be exposed to science and technology, the Yiddish speakers of the 19th century, and as a result, having dreamed other types of speculative or alternative worlds, mostly rooted in folklore, in superstition, in ghosts, and the next generation already in the United States, in Latin America, there are a number of science fiction writers that are children and grandchildren of Jewish, Yiddish-speaking immigrants that also have acknowledged that the storytelling in Yiddish in their parents and how that allowed him, opened up the doors to others, for them to become the science fiction writers that they became. There are two or three novels that were published in Yiddish, in Poland in particular, one of them in Vilna. One of them has begun to be translated into Yiddish. I have it here. I have a segment here in front of me. It is called, give me a second, not a great book, but it's called In the Future City of Edenia. In der Zukunftsstadt Edenia, the author is Kalman Zinkman, and he imagines a place that that is really his hometown, where after having traveled to Palestine and to other parts of the settlement, the Pale of Settlement, the narrator returns to this place and finds that for miraculous reasons, the place is now a site of order, equanimity, science, and technology, all kinds of suggested telephones and televisions and super fast cars are introduced in the novel in various ways. Only one of the chapters has been translated into English that give us a taste of what travel for an author like Zingman, as in lieu of education, allowed for among among those that were envisioning a better future. There is another novel in particular that I am very fond of, and well, you'll see how I let me see how I present it. Toward the end of his life, Bashevis, an author that I have spent quite a few years studying closely, edited his many 300 plus short stories into a 3-volume set published by the Library of America. And I am almost finished with a biography that has taken me a decade, hopefully being able to submit it this summer to my publisher. Toward the end of his life, Bashevis wrote a novella that is the only science fiction work he ever produced, to the best of my knowledge. There are many short stories of his that can happen in hell or can happen in heaven, but they are not science fiction in the sense of the science per se, or the space travel, or the planetary universes. Except for this one, it was found after his death at the Henry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin, and it takes place in another planet. There is a soul that identifies as being Jewish, and in this very short text, that soul is accused and ostracized because in this other alternative planet, it is Jewish, is a minority, is different than everybody else. It's not a fully formed text. There might even be some, including from myself, some contested arguments that either Zinger didn't write it on his own, or maybe even that Zinger didn't write it and that it ended up in his archives by chance or by mistake. There are elements in the book that are Zinger-like, and that makes me think that at least portions of it are written by him. It's a novel, it's a novella, and sections of it, 2 sections of it were published in the Forwards throughout the end of his life in Yiddish. I have been in conversation with his agent and with the estate, with the goal of the publishing house that Jeffrey was mentioning that I run, Restless Books, publishing it, or anybody else publishing it. I think it would be of lots of interest to the large Zinger followers. But for a variety of reasons that I can go into in some detail if there's interest, that has not yet happened. That is an interesting example of the science fiction that could have taken place. There is not as much as in the Kalman Zingman novel, there's not much reflection on technology. It's as in the case of other Zinger stories, more about the soul than about the technology itself. It reminds me of portions of Yentl, where there's the soul of a character that doesn't quite fit into the body that was given at birth and has to either turn things around, or in the case of this novel, escape that body and pullulate without the matter bringing that soul back to not Earth, but that planet where the whole novel takes place. Whatever the case is, even if it's not fully Zinger, I think that its publication would merit further debate and analysis of what could have been when the Yiddish writers like Zutzkever or Zinger or Chaim Grade lived in other parts after the Second World War. They were exposed to much more of an authentic and developed science fiction trend in other languages. And maybe that is what happens in Zinger in that particular case. Maybe that is the way he refutes or antagonizes the presentation that Sholem Aleichem makes of Haman and Mordechai. In any event, because it remains in manuscript, although it has been fully translated into English, it has not yet received the permission of the estate to be published. It is left for us to imagine what could it fully be and what would the reaction of the audience be really like. So let me wrap up things here by going back to my original view. To me, Yiddish and science fiction are an opportunity to think of Yiddish and the future, the many futures that were and the many futures that could have been. We, the Jews, are a people with a big baggage in connection with the past. But as it's clear right now in 2024, there is also a lot to say about our alternative Jewish futures, the ones that we've dreamed in the past, and the ones that actually became materialized, vis-a-vis the ones that remained an alternative. The absence of true traditional science fiction in Yiddish at the end of the 19th century and the 20th century doesn't mean that novels did not exist that are science fiction. There are two or three, nothing in my mind, although I've been involved with a bunch of them, nothing in my mind to write home about, but it is in the absence of that creation that there's much to explore, particularly because the children and the grandchildren of those immigrants embrace science, embrace technology, embrace science fiction, and have created an alternative ways to look at the future. I'll conclude with probably the one that everybody knows, Michael Chabon's novel, The Yiddish Policeman's Union, that imagines a Yiddish-speaking country taking place in Alaska, a territory that is rented for some time. It's exquisite in many ways. It is in bed with the Philip Roth of Operation Shylock, the novel that imagines what if Zionism had not taken place and there was a resettlement of the Jews in Israel back to Poland. It's incredible how that Roth novel, that Michael Chabon novel, call them utopias or dystopias, are embedded in the rise of anti-Semitism and the big, hateful statements that one hears these days among students that are pro-Palestine in many privileged campuses, and how those alternative novels speak to the various pasts and the various futures that we have had, from that moment of intense futuristic activity in the 1880s and 1990s to this moment of immense pain as we conclude the first quarter of the 21st century. Jeffrey, I'll bring it back to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. We're going to take questions now, and I think what we'll do is low technology. That is, raise your hand, and I'll scroll through the 20-something attendees and ask you to respond. Please keep your responses relatively brief. Questions?
I believe people can unmute themselves at this point. So if you have a question, unmute yourself or raise your hand.
And as you are beginning to wonder if you're going to say something or not, and maybe somebody will break the ice, I've looked just summarily at the chat. And yes, I see all those comments on Star Trek and other science fiction television and movies that were created by or acted by Jews. Leonard Nimoy was a Yiddish speaker, and he created the character of Dr. Spock, and the use of his hands and the use of certain expressions all come from the Yiddish. This is exactly what I was mentioning, how it was carried on to the next generation.
I'd like to know, how do we get the truth to spread as quickly as the lies? Like you said, that utopian stuff spread really fast. And the people that are believing that don't realize that from the river to the sea means the genocide of Israelis.
Right.
And really, the Hamas calls for worldwide, genocide. So now we're going to flip that around, call Israel the genocidal, people. How do we get the truth out there so it'll spread?
Ilan, we're off topic there, of course, but I'll turn it over to you, Ilan, if there's something you want to say.
I don't think we should not talk about what is happening. Obviously, this is about futures. This is about alternative realities. Karen, I am at the epicenter as a professor, as faculty, and as a public speaker, public intellectual in many of these discussions, pained by how easily the truth can be turned upside down, manipulated. And I don't know if I have an answer for you. I can certainly empathize and tell you that it seems to me that there's a big gap between this technology-driven young generation that sees the world in a dichotomy of the oppressed and the oppressors, white and non-white, that has its roots in the past, that has much to do with what is being taught on campus these days in an easy Manichaean way, but no easy answers there. It pains me to say.
Well, I have.
Elon, this is Jake. I have a question. Excuse me, Jeff. I'm curious that I think one of your theses is that the lack of scientific and technological education on the part of Eastern European Jews, especially in the Pale of Settlement, was one of the reasons why the utopian or fantastic literature that they had was rooted in folk tales and golems and spirits and ghosts.
Right.
And you also mentioned that the second and third generation, after people came to diaspora,
Right.
you find a lot more Jewish authors getting involved in science fiction. And I'm just wondering, do you believe it's simply because there was more technological education, or if there was a combination of both technological education and their Jewish roots, what is that connection? Have you thought about it?
I have thought long and hard on that, Jake, and let me answer by actually not narrowing on the question, but broadening on it. I am fascinated, maybe even obsessed by the fact that science fiction is a byproduct of certain cultures, but not of others that are as ancient and complex. Let me give you an example. Russia has a long tradition of science fiction. Germany, the United States, England. And because we live in English and we are connected with England, we both inherited and expanded that long tradition of utopias, dystopias that go back to Robinson Crusoe and to alternative societies in the 19th century. But in the 20th century, we pushed it in the United States to many different directions connected with science, technology in particular, traveling through space, visions of twisting time, bending it, what many of the Hollywood movies are today, or the idea of slowing age, or imagining perpetuating it in different ways. But many other cultures, and I speak here particularly as one of the cultures where I come from, Hispanic culture has no interest whatsoever Jake, with the exception of 2 or 3 that I was mentioning before, that are Jews in Argentina, in particular, has no tradition of science fiction. And it didn't have it in the Middle Ages, it didn't have it in the Renaissance, it didn't have it in the 19th century. Certainly in Latin America, it's a total absence to this day. There's Borges, there's 1 or 2 other writers, but people don't read American science fiction in Latin America, and they certainly don't produce Latin American science fiction. However, we produce something that the world consumes in huge quantities, magical realism. We create these alternative realities where what you think is a dream is actually becoming real, and then you twist and turn it, and there can be a rainstorm of butterflies, or there can be an epidemic of insomnia. We have mastered the art of imagining how nature doesn't stick into its own confines, it breaks apart. Why do certain cultures produce fiction that is connected with science and technology, and others in the 21st century continue to produce something that is connected with folklore, with magic, and with superstition? I think it has to do, and here I finally go to your wonderful question, it has to do with the role that science plays in the culture itself, not as something that has come from the outside, inherited or brought in, imported, but homegrown and pushed forward. I think that in Russia, science has always been an essential component of how to see life, in the United States, in England, but not in other parts that I'm telling you about. I could expand that to Africa. I could also expand that to other parts of the world where the science has come as a result of the importation of culture, importation of certain tropes of other parts. So I do think that we Jews, for a long time, did not have science at the center of our culture. And then we entered cultures that are futuristic, particularly in the 20th century, and embraced fully and wholeheartedly that futuristic vision to such an extent that we became main producers of it. And that's how I perceive this.
Thank you. Jeffrey, you had another question. Thank you very much.
I think there are 2 oddly contradictory currents. One is that what was called science fiction became fantasy and science fiction, and now is speculative fiction, because in fact that fiction has backed away from science, and Jewish as well as non-Jewish. On the other hand, Maurice Samuel says in 1924, oh, Jews will never be interested in science, it's like sports. Now we have 1/4 of all the Nobel Prizes.
Right.
So the literature went one way and the science went the other way. We fell in love with it. What
Absolutely.
do you think?
Absolutely. And I think that it is intrinsic to it shows, Jeffrey, the degree to which when you open up a certain fountain of knowledge in a people that have not been exposed or have not used that fountain of knowledge for a long time, it can become an essential part of them. As you said, 1/4 of the Nobel Prize winners are today Jews, but not in the 19th century, not in the 18th century. I would also, I'd like to slightly modify something you said, or maybe beg to push it in. Though we don't have science fiction in the traditional sense in Jewish life until rather recently, and certainly in Yiddish only as imitations of other artifacts that were being published in Polish, in Russian, etc. What we certainly have is the imagination of alternative realities. And I think that when Herzl writes the Jewish state and suggests that we can build a Jewish state as Jews, though he is a journalist and a politician, he is delving into that tradition of what do we imagine the new homeland to be. And we have both utopias and dystopias in the Bible. You know, when Jonah goes into the belly of the whale, or when you have visions like Ezekiel of chariots descending from heaven with monster-like figures, many-headed. That's fantasy. That's speculative fiction. That's also religion. That's also superstition. That's also folklore, all coalescing with one another. When you have, I'm teaching next week. I'm lecturing next week at the 92nd Street Y on the Book of Job. And in the very first two chapters of the Book of Job, you have what some call the adversary, others call Satan, the devil, a non-God that tempts God to do things in unorthodox ways, especially to put to test this most devout of follower, Job, kill his children, take away his wealth to see what would happen. It's kind of an experiment. I think that you also have there the incipient elements of fantasy fiction that is about not having what you have, disappearing the elements that you have. For me, one of the most eloquent anecdotes that keeps on being repeated time and time again in the Talmud, Jeffrey, is the one of the four rabbis that enter the Pardes, the garden. And one loses his mind, one commits suicide, and Rabbi Akiva returns and becomes a big figure. And I think that I love that episode because it poses the question to me, what's the Pardes? What's this garden that the rabbis go into? It could be the Garden of Eden. It could be an alternative reality. It could be, and some have suggested, an alternative state of consciousness. And this is about four rabbis losing their mind or becoming apostates. I think that there is a science fiction speculative fantasy twist to all of that runs in the tradition, very in the Talmud certainly, but cannot be described as science fiction because the scientific side is not quite there. It will take time to come to the Jews, and that will be the result of immigration, to the reshaping of the Jewish diasporic map, and to the influence of other cultures in who we are.
Are there other questions or comments? If you speak up, your face will appear.
I have.
There's one.
I've been thinking about magic realism. And when you first mentioned it, it seemed to me that magic realism, and this is what I wanted to ask you, is not dissimilar to the thinking of the Yiddish writers like Isaac Bashevis Singer. I don't see it as in any way connected to science fiction,
right?
Rather connected, well, to the pre-science fiction. And I just find myself wondering if this is not something that is particular to religion. For example, the fact that there is so little science fiction in Latin America, but magic realism thrives very much the way its equivalent survived in Eastern Europe. And could that not be because of the influence of religion, of the
absolutely,
Catholic
absolutely.
Church?
I think, one of the there are two or three, you already know about this, moments of inception of magical realism. One in particular, most famous one, is when one of the first magical realist writers, having spent sufficient time in France and falling in love with surrealism, André Breton and some of those figures of the early 20th century, travels to Haiti. He was Cuban. Travels to Haiti and then comes back and writes a piece where he says that Latin America has a suspended, interrupted development. It remains very primitive, but it has moved into the 20th century with a primitivism that is struggling to coexist with modernity all the time. So things feel interrupted, and yet they also feel ancient, and that the surrealists could really learn a lot from Latin Americans, because Latin Americans, according to Alejo Carpentier, this writer, are the ones that truly know how to mix the real and the surreal. And that kind of triggers the whole thing forward. And then you have 100 Years of Solitude, and you have Borges, who likes science fiction, but is also writing folklore. And I think that Bashevis is a writer having been the child of a rabbi, but a mother who's really a rationalist. He takes the name after his mother, Batsheva, and calls himself Bashevis, and has this constant struggle within himself of the rationalist, the modernist that he wants to be, with the folklorist, the one that deals with the demons and the debooks. And his first novel is about an exorcism, Satan in Gorai, of a girl that is possessed by this demon, and people don't really know what to do with her. So I think that the reason why, one of the arguments that I make in the biography is that after the Second World War, after the destruction of Ashkenazi Jewry, when many of the children of immigrants in the United States, former Yiddish speakers, found themselves longing for a world that was no more, had been destroyed, here comes a man who knows what modernity is, and yet is also deeply connected with the ghosts, with the superstitions of the past, and takes them seriously enough to turn them into tales. And those tales start appearing in the forewords, but ultimately lead to the New Yorker publishing them, and Playboy and Esquire. He is satisfying a deep need of a new generation that wants still to be connected with a folklore that had been destroyed. And I think that was happening in Latin America at the same time, the connection. So I wouldn't call Bashevis a magical realist, but I wouldn't call him alien to many of the aspects that magical realism was offering.
Thank you. That was kind of my impression.
Are there other questions or comments?
Absent other questions, Ilan, I want to give you an opportunity for you to tell us about an upcoming book that you have. It's not on this topic, but I'm curious.
Yes. Well, I am about to publish two books. One of them comes out in October. It's called Sabor Judío, the Jewish Mexican Cookbook. It's a cookbook of Jewish Mexican food that has 100 recipes, and through them, it also tells the story of the Jews of Mexico from the colonial times to the present, the crypto Jews and the Sephardic, Latino-speaking Jews, and of course the Ashkenazi Jews, and then the Israelis that have come. I'm very excited about it.
The publisher.
The publisher is Ferris and Ferris, a big publisher of cookbooks. And then in November, there's a terrific Latin American, Argentine poet, a Yiddish speaker who became a communist, Juan Gelman, and is the face of the dirty war in Argentina. He died in 2014. Who won, I guess, all of the famous, except for the Nobel Prize, all the important prizes in the Spanish-speaking and the general world. At one point, he was forced out of Argentina because of his politics during the military junta. And something fascinating happened to him, Jake. He, alone in his exile, discovered Yehuda Levi and Shmuel Anagid and Sholem Ibn Gabirol and other medieval Hebrew poets. He did not know Hebrew, and he became a passionate reader of them and rewrote those poems into Spanish and then taught himself Ladino and wrote an entire book in Ladino. And I translated all of the poems in an archaeological way, translated all of the poems that he writes about the medieval Hebrew poets, finding the sources that he took and how he misunderstood or he fully understood, and then traced his interest in the type of Ladino that follows. That is a book that is coming out in November. So I'm excited about both.
Wow. You
Any other questions or
a
comments?
polymath. My applause. Are there any other questions? I want to thank you very much, Ilan. I did not know you. You did not know us. I emailed you and introduced Chicago Evo Society. You were kind enough to respond quickly. And I'm thrilled to get to know you. And I'm certainly going to get that cookbook when it comes out. And maybe you'll have another Zoom with us after it comes out and talk about some of the recipes. I'm quite curious.
Absolutely. Mit der größten Vergnügen. Being with all of you has been a joy. Just to know that you exist and that you are using this futuristic technology to bring everybody to this little shtetl on my screen is an absolute pleasure. Sei gesund, be well, all of you. Continue to thrive and to read, and may we see each other again soon.
Thank you very much. And thank everybody for participating.
I look forward
Bye-bye.
to the book.